Happy Wednesday. I'm thankful to have you join me again for our study on the book of Genesis on our Wednesdays in the Word study. We're going to continue our study in the story of Abram and Sarai. As we continue on in their story, last week we discussed the call of Abram and his kind of test in fear and dealing with fear and uncertainty, scarcity, and then kind of his redemption from that as he trusted God and he and Lot separated, parted ways, went their separate ways. And so today we're going to continue on in the story in chapter 14. Now remember, in chapter 13, Abram and Lot have separated peacefully. Abram gave Lot the choice of which way he wanted to go. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And Lot chose what he thought was the better land or looked better. But as we'll see in chapter 14 here, Lot ends up landing kind of in the middle of a region that is in the midst of conflict. And as a result of that, he suffers because of that. At the beginning of chapter 14, it's a lot of what I call really hard words, difficult to read, but it is important to kind of notice here that there's conflict that's going on between several regions, tribes, nations, groups of people here over this, maybe this particular segment of land that kind of centers around the city of Sodom, which is where Lot has and his family have moved near to. So there's these four tribes who are ruled by kings, and they all seize. In verse 11 of chapter 14, we're told that the four kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. And then we read kind of the response of this. One of the people comes back and reports this to Abram, and Abram does a rather bold thing here. He risks everything and takes some men with him to go kind of maybe in the middle of the night, takes them and they kind of circle the camp and they rescue Lot and his household and bring them back home to where they belong. And that's, like I say, a risky move, but it's also a good move. And we're going to focus, for the purpose of our study here today, on this particular chapter. We're not going to spend a lot of time in chapter 14, but there are a couple of things that I want you to take notice of. Is the reaction then, what happens when Abram comes back, returns to the Sodom and Gomorrah area after rescuing Lot. In verse 17, then we are told, after Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. Two kings here. And one is the king of Sodom, which is where Lot and his family have been living nearby and probably living in the city. And then Melchizedek, the king of Salem. Now it's important to note here that Salem means peace in Hebrew. But this is more than likely, according to most of the rabbis and Bible commentary people and everything, that this Salem is actually Jerusalem. And so Melchizedek, we are told his reaction first when he comes out. And Melchizedek, we are told, is a priest of the God Most High. And it's important to note here that Melchizedek is a Canaanite. So he's not descended from Shem. In fact, he is descended from the son of Ham, Canaan. And yet he is a priest of the God Most High. He brings Abram some sustenance, brings bread and wine. And then in verse 19, we are told, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. So Melchizedek glorifies God. He recognizes that Abram has been successful because the hand of God Most High, the one true God, Yahweh, the hand of God is upon Abram. And so he recognizes that Abram is blessed by God. Abram is protected by God. And so he brings him a gift and gives him a blessing. Abram's response to this then is to tithe. He gives this king a tenth of everything. So there's that response. And then moving on to verse 21, the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself. Sodom, the king of Sodom glorifies, instead of glorifying God, he glorifies Abram. He thinks that this is an act of humanity, doesn't recognize that this mission to rescue Lot has been successful only by the hand and provision of God. Abram's response to that is to say, no, I've raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the thong of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. So Abram glorifies God in this and kind of sets the king of Sodom straight here on who's responsible for this success. So now we move on to chapter 15, which is probably the most significant part of our study today. I just want to kind of note here, as we're reading about Abram, notice that Abram's faith journey here takes kind of a roller coaster kind of ride. He vacillates between moments of great trust and faith in God and then some fear and anxiety. And we're going to continue to see that kind of play out. We saw it last week. And we don't see it this week in the two chapters that we're going to be using, we're working on this week, but we'll see it next week. Trust me. So chapter 15, I'm going to begin reading at verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Here we see that God has recognized Abram maybe has some fears, has some doubts, has some questions. God sees Abram's heart and tries to still those fears, to calm those fears in Abram. And I think that's significant here because remember, Sarah is barren. She cannot have children, and God has promised to make of Abram and Sarai a great nation. And one can imagine that now there's been some time that has passed, and Abram is starting to get a little bit worried here. Can I trust what God has promised me? Can I believe it? There are some moments of doubt because the barrenness persists. So God comes and he says, don't be afraid. I am your shield. I am your very great reward. And then moving on in verse 2, we hear then Abram give voice to those fears. This is not wrong for us to give voice to talk to God about our fears and anxieties, Abram does that. Then he says, but Abram says, O sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Abram voices his concerns. The barrenness persists, and Abram's uncertain. Look, God, you promised me an heir. You promised me this land. Both of those things, as we talked about last week, are connected. And yet Abram sees, I'm not seeing any of this. I have no heir. And in fact, the person who is going to inherit all of my estate is a servant of my household. And so I am a little bit worried about that. The word of the Lord, then, we are told, comes back to Abram in verse 4. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir. Then God took him outside and said, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. All right, this is the third promise of an heir that we have seen. Remember, first, God promised Abram that he would make his name great. His descendants would be great and inherit this land. He would make of him a great nation. Then he told him that his offspring would be as numerous as the dust of the earth. And now God says, a son will come from your own body. And it will be that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Try and count the stars, Abram. Can you count them? I remember when I was a little kid, I would try and do that sometimes, and I'd give up. I'd get lost. I mean, there was no way. So that's a huge promise for Abram here. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. A son from your own body will come. Verse 6 is significant here. In fact, it is so significant that Paul will refer to it several times in his writings, both in the book of Romans and in his letter to the Galatians. Verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abram believes, and it is credited to him as righteousness. Abram is one of a long line here who have been called righteous throughout so far the scriptures that we've studied. Remember, Abel is called righteous. Enoch, another descendant of Adam, is called righteous, and Noah, of course. Noah was a righteous man. So Abram is credited with righteousness. But notice here that the righteousness is tied to Abram's faith. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Who is the he here? Well, clearly it is God. Abram doesn't do righteousness. He doesn't do anything. It is credited to him. It is given to him. This righteousness is given to him by God because of his faith in what God has said. God has said it. Abraham believes that it will be accomplished. And then God goes on in verse 7. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? How can I know? So we see the faith maybe begin to waver just a little bit here. And then a very interesting event takes place. This is critical. This, I think, is the turning point for Abram. This is the point. What happens next is what solidifies it for Abraham, and that will figure very greatly later on in Abram's story. God can be trusted, God will be faithful to his promises. God tells Abram, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram knows what this means. This is the establishing of a covenant. Now, in that time, a covenant was something that was made between two individuals, and it was a binding contract, so to speak, a promise among both parties that they would both be faithful to the terms of the covenant or the contract. And the way that they would do this is to take these animals that are typically used for sacrifice, cut them in half, and separate both halves, lay one half facing the other, which is what Abram did. He brought these, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half, probably because they were too small. So he lays this out. This is ready for the covenant to take place. Notice, though, as we read on, how this happens. Like I said, a covenant usually is something that happens between two individuals. But as we move on, verse 12, as the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions." This is prophecy. We believe and understand that this will look forward to the time of the Israelites being slaves in Egypt, and then the great act of the Exodus and God's salvation of the people. Verse 15, God says, "You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." So there's a promise again here. Your descendants are going to suffer, but don't worry about it. I will protect them. Then moving on, verse 17, we're going to watch the covenant continue to take place now. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." All the ites, as I like to call them. All right, remember how I said a covenant was made between two people. And in order to ensure that both people were going to be in agreement with this covenant and be faithful to the covenant and uphold each their side, the animals were split in half. And then what would happen was that each individual would walk down the center of the covenant. It was a symbolic way of them saying, what has happened to these animals. If I break the covenant, this will happen to me too. I will be split in two. And so it's usually two parties that are doing this walking. Both parties are doing the walking back and forth. But notice this time, it is only God that does the moving back and forth. And God is represented by this smoking fire pot with a blazing torch. God is the only one who passes in between the halves. God is the one who is making the covenant, and God will keep the covenant. Like I said, I think this is a turning point for Abram. I think Abram realizes at this point that this is serious. God is serious about the promise that he has made. He has done this great ritual to show me his seriousness. And then God renews the covenant again, restates it again. I will give you this land, to you and your descendants. Again, the land is tied to an heir. Both things must happen. God is the one who makes this promise, this covenant. It is unbreakable, unshakable. That's why Abram believes God, and it is credited to Abram as righteousness. God makes the covenant. God gives Abram the ability, the opportunity, the proof, if you would, well, not even proof, but God gives Abram the ability to believe. And that is what makes Abram righteous then, is because of this gift of faith that God has given to Abram. And because of that gift of faith, Abram is made righteous. And we are all given that same gift of faith, and we are all made righteous in the covenant that God makes with us. Of course, the covenant of our baptism. Because of the work of Jesus Christ on the cross, we are promised that we will live with him in eternity. God is always faithful to the promises that he makes. Like I say, I believe that this was a turning point for Abram. And that doesn't mean that Abram won't have problems and he won't have challenges, because certainly we know, if you're familiar with Abram's story, we know that there will be challenges to Abram's faith in God and in God's ability to keep the covenant. I will say this, as we prepare to go into the story next week, I want you to kind of focus again and remember that statement that God says to Abram in verse 4. He says, a son coming from your own body will be your heir. That, I think, influences somewhat how Abram chooses to react in the decisions that he makes as we move forward. But that's a story for next week. Thank you for being with me this week on this study, and let's close our time together with prayer. Gracious God, we are grateful that you love us, so much that you invite us into an intimate relationship with you through what Christ did for us on the cross. We are thankful that you have established your covenant with us through his sacrifice on our behalf. And we thank you for allowing us to remain in relationship with you even when we have doubts and fears. Thank you for forgiving us. Keep us faithful and help us to remember the promises that you have made, and to remember that you are faithful to keep your promises, and to rely on those promises and the faithfulness of you, the one who makes the covenant with us. Pray your blessing on us as we journey through this week. We thank you for the gift of your word. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. All right, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you next week as we move into chapter 16. This is one of those situations now when we're going to see Abraham's roller coaster of faith take a little bit of a downward turn. Have a blessed week. Thanks for joining.